immediately supported by the Bush administration and many powerful countries in the world. I was recalling during the 2000 elections in the United States being in Serbia and people joking that the worst thing that could happen to us is that Al Gore would be president, because then we'll have the Democrats continuing to focus on us, and if Bush is president, he'll ignore us. And, well, of course, Bush immediately recognized Kosovo, and that sort of seals the deal in a sense. But it's important to remember how we got to this point. I mean, Samantha was talking a little bit about the broader context here. The fact is that this was sort of Clinton's Iraq in a way. He bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days with no United Nations mandate. I was at the UN the night that it began, and Kofi Annan was sort of beside himself that the action had been taken so swiftly, this military action. 78 days of bombing of Yugoslavia under the auspices of NATO. Wesley Clark was the commander of those operations, the Supreme Allied Commander. They bombed a Serbian television station, killing 16 media workers. Some of them were media workers, some of them were makeup artists, others were engineers. They directly targeted passenger trains and then fabricated a video afterwards to make it seem as though it was a split-second decision. They killed thousands of civilians, and the fact was that the exaggerations of what was happening in Kosovo by William Cohen, the defense secretary at the time, who talked about 1 million missing people, and then it was scaled back to 100,000, then 50,000, then 10,000, and now the official numbers is that there were 2,700 people that were killed, and there's been no determination of their ethnicity. Now, I can tell you from being on the ground in Kosovo that some of the worst violence that occurred, slaughtering of Albanians, happened after the NATO bombing began. And the fact was that the U.S. sabotaged the work of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the weeks leading up to the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And I think that what we have to understand here is that this is where the sort of liberals like Hillary Clinton come together with the neocons, because there are a lot of similarities between what happened in Yugoslavia and what happened in Iraq, with the lead up to the war, the disregard for international law or international consensus, and then the outright killing of civilians under the auspices of humanitarian intervention.
But Samantha Power, your response, and you're saying Barack Obama isn't that different on this issue than Hillary Clinton in his attitude to what has happened.
Well, I think he feels like it has come to this point, and as I said, there was going to be major violence in Kosovo if the status of the province was left untended to. I do have a different perspective from Jeremy from that period as one who spent time in Kosovo in advance of the NATO bombing and wondered what on earth was going to be the fate of those people if the Serbian regime remained in power, and disagree with some of the specific facts of what he said about what actually happened during the bombing. But I think the important fact is that we reveal over time, in academia, one talks about revealed preferences, revealed agendas. If we could put the people of Kosovo finally at the centerpiece of our thinking about what to do about the region, or the people of Serbia for that matter, I mean, whatever the motives are for getting involved, whatever happened back in 1999, and I'm not saying we should brush it under the rug by any means, but what is revealed again and again is when we pay attention to these kind of places, it's a spasm. And it's usually for some combination of something to do with national interest. At that time, it was probably NATO credibility. But I have to say, if it weren't for the atrocities against the Kosovo Albanians, there would not have been an intervention. It wasn't merely about NATO credibility. You don't just go bomb gratuitously. And I recognize that I'm probably in the minority at this table in believing this to be true. But having gone in, you had a responsibility to the province. You had a responsibility to the Serbian minority. And what happened is we got involved and then turned our attention elsewhere. And Bush, in coming into office, pulled U.S. troops out of Kosovo, basically said, this isn't my problem, and then started to pay attention at the moment we recognized Kosovo's independence. That's not the way you go. You don't sort of spasm here, spasm there. It's going to produce this kind of turbulence and this kind of violence.
What the United States did, though, right after NATO forces entered Yugoslavia, is they brought in some high-profile thugs and criminals, people like Agam Ceku, who became the commander, the military commander of the Kosovo Liberation Army. This was a man who was a war criminal from the war in Bosnia when he served in the Croatian military. He was trained by a U.S. mercenary company called Military Professional Resources Incorporated. He was the guy that the United States was basically bolstering to become the new head of the Kosovo army. And it's quite interesting that that man is a war criminal. And the fact is that Camp Bondsteel is of tremendous significance to the United States for geopolitical reasons. And I think that's one of the reasons why Bush moved so swiftly to support the independence of Kosovo, is that the government in Pristina is very easy to manipulate. The government in Belgrade, that's a tougher story. Vojislav Koštunica, who's one of the main political figures, the prime minister of the country, is a fairly right-wing isolationist, and I don't think would be too happy about a U.S. U.S. military base operating on Serbian soil. But you know, in response to some of what Samantha was saying, in the 1990s, the worst humanitarian crises in the world, certainly Rwanda and other African nations, certainly in Europe, but Iraq. I mean, where is the label of genocide for the U.S. policy toward Iraq? It was Bill Clinton who initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam against Iraq under the guise of humanitarian intervention in the north and south of that country. The sanctions killing hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, we have had one of the greatest mass slaughters in history, in modern history, in Iraq, going from 1990 to the present, and yet everyone talks about this as though it's not genocide, as though it's not part of that bigger picture. Clinton selling weapons to the Turks to slaughter the Kurds. I mean, there were all sorts of horrific things happening in the world, and it's the selectivity of U.S. foreign policy that I think is really outrageous. It's not that no one should do anything about it. It's that the Iraqis, it's sort of, you know, good victims, bad victims.
Samantha Power.
Where does one start? I mean, I would just like to know, I guess, or just ask the question is, since you've spent so much time there, at the moment that we're at now, what do we do, in fact? I mean, are you suggesting that then basically the Kosovo should become part of Serbia? I mean, I felt like we hit a stalemate and something had to budge. There was going to be violence in Kosovo, and I don't mean to brush all the crimes of American foreign policy under the rug, and I've written extensively also about sanctions and the toll of sanctions and so forth in Iraq, but just to
is that genocide,
to stick to this moment, no, but we can talk about that. I don't think the Clinton administration set out to deliberately destroy the Iraqi people as such.
Oh, I totally disagree, but what Madeleine Albright said, it was worth the price, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi victims.
So can I just ask, so what exactly do we do now in terms of Kosovo as one who has spent a lot of time there?
Now I think we have a very serious problem, because I think, and as Professor Robert Hayden from the University of Pittsburgh pointed out last night, who of course is fluent in Serbian, spent a lot of time there, and is a specialist in international law, there could have been some kind of a negotiated border agreement, I think, where the Serbs would have been guaranteed protection. I mean, I was talking to sources in Serbia last night who said that now the Serbian military is actually engaging in incursions into the northern part of Kosovo. This could potentially be a very serious issue, and I think that even if we look at it from the most mainstream political perspective, it was unwise for the U.S. to come in so swiftly without giving the Serbian government an opportunity to deal with the safety of the Serbs in Mitrovica and in some of those border areas. And I think internally in Serbia now, one of the reasons we're seeing so much protest is that the Milosevic government had a despicable policy toward refugees from all of the various former Yugoslav republics who found themselves in Serbia. And you have literally hundreds of thousands of Serbs who are sort of left without a place to go and don't have full rights in Serbia. And I just think it was very poor diplomacy on the part of the Bush administration to do this so swiftly. And I think it raises serious questions about what the U.S. agenda there is. So we have a very serious international crisis there right now.
I just think to call it swift when for 9 years Kosovo's status has been hanging in limbo is not right, and part of the issue is even stipulating everything you said about NATO bombing, what exactly do you do then about a province that is hanging by a thread, where you have a Serbian minority? I mean, one of the things that I think we don't talk near enough about is that there are no takers for the demand that monitors be put into Kosovo. You don't see European governments, you don't see other international governments around, you don't see people stepping up to say, you know, I prefer to do more than simply denounce George Bush. I'd actually like to help the Serbian minority in Kosovo. Those minority rights protections have been in play for 2 years. The Serbian government wasn't interested in negotiating and being a part of anything that would constitute a compromise in terms of Kosovo's future.
Is your sense that the rush or the quick movement of the Bush administration to support this independence is in some way affected also by the continuing tensions between the United States and the rest of the Muslim world? That this is because I would assume that in other parts of the Muslim world there's support for this for Kosovo independence.
Can I just push back a little on this idea of swiftness again? I wasn't very articulate just now, but there's been a process overseen by the United Nations by Matti Ahtisaari, the former Finnish Prime Minister, for I think now going on 3 years as basically an effort to do this peaceably. I don't see how there was ever going to be a way to get out of this bind without offending either Serbia or the ethnic Albanians, and either stemming violence in Serbia or stemming violence in Kosovo. But whether there could have been a compromise or not, it was an international diplomat who has the respect, allegedly anyway, of both sides, who tried to come up with a solution which would have protected the Serbian minority and would have protected, hopefully, ethnic Albanians as well. That was rejected. There were no negotiations that were accepted by Serbia. Then at a certain point, the Albanians said, okay, after 3 years, we're going to declare independence, or this is going to explode. Now, they don't care about the Serbian minority at all. They just assume the Serbs be cleansed. I couldn't agree with Jeremy more. But the idea that this is swift, what it is a swift response to the Declaration of Independence in the hopes almost that it'll just go away, that if you could just get enough countries within the UN to recognize this independence, then maybe that will, cooler heads will prevail. And the irony of what happened yesterday in Belgrade is there's some chance that perhaps the perverse counter effect to the violence is that maybe in Serbia this will actually, because of the fear